my first question that we're going to start out with is, what is coffee? Again, coffee is a lot of things to a lot of people. I would love for you, yeah, just to type some responses in here. Like, what's that first thing that comes to your mind? You think, what is coffee? Everybody, some time to think about it. Livelihood, I love it. Happiness. Could be phrases, one word, whatever you think. A drink, most definitely. A roasted seed, love it. Tropical fruit. It's kind of cool. I haven't used this little poll thing. It's a way of life, absolutely. I think, for myself, like thinking about what coffee was to me when I was a kid, it was like a drink that like my family would have around dessert at lunch, right? And then kind of evolve and start going to coffee shops, and coffee became a routine. Love. Let's see what else we got. Fire, morning salvation. It became more of a routine, or like a place to gather, right? You kind of develop a community around it, and then you start working in coffee, and your definition really begins to evolve. Coffee is a lot of things for a lot of people. And so I think a lot of really common answers I get when I ask this question, it starts out really simple for most, right? It's a beverage, it's a way to wake up. And maybe as you become more of a coffee drinker, it becomes a routine or a hobby. We've seen it as a trend. And then I think as we get deeper and deeper into coffee, it can become a craft, a livelihood. The community we surround ourselves with, we get more familiar with coffee as an entire industry, right? And so, I think this answer evolves based on our interaction with coffee, right? So much of our current thought about what coffee is just based on how we've interacted with it in the past. And I think specifically for like myself growing up in a consuming country, everything kind of branches off the fact that coffee is a drink. All my other different kind of meanings I associate to it are based off that fact that it is a drink. But as many of us know, there's much more that coffee is before it's ever a drink, right? That's really the last thing it is. And so, I'm hoping that this series of classes can kind of help us define, different things that coffee is. My definition now greatly varies from like how my grandparents would have defined what coffee is for them, right? And I think my family's definition of coffee has evolved just because I now work in coffee and they ask me questions about it. And I think if, we ask somebody who grows up in a producing country versus somebody who grows up in a consuming country, there'd be different definitions between those people, right? And so my hope is that these classes expand our understanding of everything that coffee is. And as we gain a greater perspective of what all coffee is, we gain a deeper appreciation for it, right? And I think it's very important to have an open mind, to never judge somebody for what they think coffee is or how they enjoy it, because all of us has had different interactions with it, right? And so let's go ahead and jump into our first class. Our first class of coffee it's a plant, right? Coffee is an agricultural product. It is a plant really before it is anything else. And so in today's class, we are going to discuss these different topics. We're going to look at coffee's taxonomy, how it's categorized in the plant world, and in tandem, look at its anatomy. We're going to examine the differences between the two most commonly consumed species of coffee, Arabica and canephora, Robusta. Then we are going to dive specifically into Arabica the most today. We're going to look at its speciation, how it came to be, its expansion throughout the world, and a problem that Arabica faces. And then we will dive deeper into Arabica and look at specific varieties. We're going to look at the 4 large groups of varieties, and then we will dive into, well, we'll kind of zoom back out and look at coffee's habitat, where it's produced and imported. Things we won't talk about much today is like coffee's life cycle. We're mostly just going to look at like basic anatomy structure, the life cycle, and how coffee is cultivated is what I plan to get into in our next class. So let's go ahead and get into today's class. Thank you everybody for putting some answers in that box right there. Section 1, taxonomy and anatomy. Taxonomy is a system of classifying organisms, more specifically. There's a lot of terminology we might go over. I think we will hit all of these in the slides. As we kind of go through coffee's taxonomy, which you'll see listed here on the left, we're going to kind of work through coffee's life cycles from seedling to, kind of an immature plant to a mature fruit-bearing plant. And as we get deeper into coffee's taxonomy, we can apply more and more labels to the anatomy of coffee. And so if you have any questions, again, throw them out there for me. Some interesting history. 1713 is the first kind of recorded taxonomic description of coffee by French naturalist Antoine de Jussot. He was studying coffee in the botanical gardens of Amsterdam, and he called it Jasminum arabicum. Jasminum meaning white flowers. Arabicum is how all plants that kind of came by way of Arabia to Amsterdam were labeled. Coffee specifically from Yemen. In 1737, Carl Linnaeus placed coffee in its own genus. Carl Linnaeus is the father of modern taxonomy, and he applied the genus name Café. And then way down the road in 1947, Jean-Baptiste Chevalier grouped Café into 4 subgenuses: Eucafé, Mascaro Café, Agro Café, and Para Café. Most of the coffees we consume would be in the Eucafé and Mascaro Café subgenus. These were the genuses that produce caffeine. And there are today more subgenuses. Some subgenuses have moved around, and we are now at a point where coffee kind of has a full taxonomic definition, and that's what we're going to be looking at. So we'll look at the coffee seedling here and talk through kingdom, phylum, and class. Kingdom, Plantae. It's a land plant. It's pretty straightforward. All land plants are in this kingdom. For phylum, Tracheophyta. Coffee is an angiosperm, meaning it has roots, stems, leaves, and it produces or reproduces with seeds and spores. So you can see here, this is coffee's seed growing on a root, bursting forth from the ground. We see the stem, we see the leaves. Tracheophytas have vascular tissue. Vascular tissue is the tissue that runs from the roots to the very tips of the leaves. The most important things we'll note here are the xylem and phloem tissue within the vascular tissue. Xylem transports water, and it stores water in water-soluble nutrients. Phloem transports sugars, proteins, and other organic molecules throughout the plant. Up next, we have our class, Magnoliopsida. Coffee is a flowering dicotyledon, meaning that coffee germinates with 2 seed leaves. And you can see this in this photo, right? There's 2 leaves that are coming from that seed. Flowering dicots produce flowers, and coffee is a flower-producing plant, and all flower-producing plants bear fruit. Roses and oak trees are also part of this class. They sprout with 2 leaves. And then plants within this class have branching venation, meaning the veins in the leaves branch in pairs from the center stem. So I think it's interesting to note here that coffee is of an ancient plant order. This is thought to be kind of the oldest order of plants in existence. And, you know, as we get into the next slide here, again, we're not going to really discuss details about the life cycle of the plant, but I think this video is amazing. This is a video that Cafe Imports produced a long time ago, but you can kind of see again that seed breaking open with those dicot leaves, and then the rest of the coffee begins to be produced on that stem. Wonderful. Let's keep going here. Let's kind of look at our young to flowering plant. So kind of categorize this in years 1 through 5 as coffee matures. You know, it goes from being a seedling to kind of 1 foot tall up to however tall that coffee tends to get, right? So the order coffee is in, Gentianalis. This order contains plants that have opposing leaves. So anywhere one leaf sprouts, another leaf sprouts from that same point. More than 80% of the plants in this order fall into the family Rubicae, which is next. So Rubicae is plants that are trees, shrubs, and herbs. It's a pretty large family, right? And I'm actually curious. I'm going to drop another poll here because I've heard lots of terms in my coffee career, but is coffee a tree, shrub, or herb? I'd be curious to see what everybody here thinks. So we're 50-50 between tree and shrub right now. We won't spend a ton of time here, but I think it is a really interesting question because I've absolutely heard the word shrub, I've heard tree, I've heard bush, I've heard a lot of different terms for what coffee like technically is. Before we kind of get into that, let's define what a family is. So the family Rubicae. A family are plants that have similar flowers, leaves, and reproductive structures, and they're evolutionarily related. Plants in the same family tend to have similar growth characteristics and nutrients needs, and they often have the same pests and pathogens, herbivores, things like that. I should have put an animal example in this. I will think about that. But this family Rubicae, again, it's the 4th largest flowering plant family. There are anywhere between 600 to 13,000 species within the family Rubicae. It's a very large family. Some economically important examples we've heard of are cinchona, which produces quinine, kratom, which, you know, I used to see on billboards all over the place, gardenia, lots of different flowers just grown for their beauty, madder, which produces dyes, and then lots of timber is in the Rubicae family that we use. So trees, shrubs, and herbs. Coffee is technically a tree. Even more technically, if you want to get really specific, based on its size, it is a treelet, just a small tree. The difference between shrubs and herbs. Herbs are not woody, meaning they don't have extra growth around their stems. They don't produce tree rings. And then shrubs don't have one primary middle branch. They have the roots and then multiple branches from that base. Trees all have like one primary trunk that the branches all come from. And that's what categorizes coffee as a tree, technically. Let's go into evergreen leaves. The leaves don't change colors throughout the year. The flowers are really white, sometimes pinkish, really fragrant 5-petal flowers. And they are categorized as tubular, sympatalous, actinomorphic petals. What that means, tubular, sympatalous, that means the petals join together at the base, forming a tubular shape. Actinomorphic means the flowers have radial symmetry, right? You can divide them straight in half, so 5 radial petals. The flowers open after a rainy season. They last for a few days, maybe a week, and then they fall away, and fruit begins to produce where that ovary is. The ovary is an inferior ovary, so it's just at the base of those tubular petals. And the last point, fruit and seed bearing. All plants within Arabica are fruit and seed bearing because all of these plants flower. All right, so now we're getting into a mature coffee plant, a fruit-bearing, fully mature coffee plant. Could be 4, 5, 6 years, depending on the variety and growing conditions. But here we will look at the genus Coffea. This is where we get more closely to what we're used to drinking coffee from. So all plants within the Coffea genus have these elliptical, kind of full, not jagged leaves. The leaves are waxy on the surface, and then they're kind of matte on the underside. And the stems of the leaves are really flexible, so they can turn to face the sun. Coffee has an orthotropic stem, again, kind of that middle trunk that classifies it as a tree that all these branches spring from. And then for the branches, we have opposing primary branches. So you can kind of see here in the middle of this picture, this branch and then the branch across from it. Branches grow in similar spots opposing, kind of like the leaves do. And then from those very first primary branches, you can get secondary growth and tertiary growth. I'm going to go back real quick. And so secondary and tertiary growth takes a while for coffee plants, but yeah, you can get a branch off of your primary branch and then another one off of that. You can trim secondary and tertiary branches back to get new growth. You cannot trim primary branches off and get new growth from those, but that is a common thing you'll see to extend a plant's longevity in their fruit bearing. You can trim back tertiary and secondary branches to bring new growth the next season. And then plants within the genus Coffea are kind of classified as tropical woody understory perennials. We will come back to this phrase because it's a really great way to kind of define coffee's habitat. So we'll come back to that a little bit later, but I feel like up to this point, going through the taxonomy of coffee, we've got a pretty good picture of the characteristics all coffee species share. But as we get into species deeper, we start to get more and more distinct. And so before we dive into the species, individual species, we're going to continue with the anatomy train, and we're going to look at the roots and the coffee fruit itself. So roots here. Purpose of roots, I think all of us could kind of come up with what the purpose of roots. They anchor the plant in the ground, right? They are responsible for uptaking water and nutrients, and they store that energy in those roots and deliver it to the plant as it's needed. Getting some echo here. So let's look at the different parts of the roots. I think roots are really interesting because you can't really define a root structure. Roots will adapt to the surroundings to optimize the amount of resources it can uptake. So there's no real kind of pattern to roots, but there are different parts. So you have the central taproot, which goes a half a meter down to 1 meter down typically, so about 1.5 to 3 feet down into the earth. The lateral roots are the roots here that run across the top in the topsoil layer. Typically, the topsoil layer is about 2 to 8 inches deep, but those roots just spread across the top. And then you have axial roots. Axial roots are this entire section of lower roots branching from your central taproot. And these are pretty much responsible for extending our feeder roots and then the root hairs on the feeder roots. These feeder roots and root hairs are responsible for 98% of the water uptake for the plant. They also provide lots of mineral nutrition. Root hairs are constantly shedding and regrowing from day to day to day. And so that's kind of the basic root structure of coffee. Now let's get into the fruit and seed. So a lot of these terms we have probably heard, but it's still fascinating to look at how the fruit and the seed kind of works with each other. So coffee fruit, another kind of technical term here, but coffee fruit, what we commonly call coffee cherries, are technically a drupe, which is kind of like a stone fruit. Drupes are classified basically as fleshy fruit with a thin skin, and drupes contain a stone that holds a seed. So plums, cherries, almonds, olives, they're all drupes. So that is kind of the classification of a coffee fruit. So let's get into the anatomy of this fruit. The exocarp, the outermost skin, right? This is the protective tissue of the coffee fruit. It's green for most of a coffee cherry's life. And then it becomes yellow and then red as chlorophyll pigments leave. And then new pigments are developing, changing the color of the coffee. But yeah, it's pretty thin. The fruit isn't in the exocarp. It's a protective layer. Then the mesocarp. So that shiny kind of gelatinous material around the seed, what we call the mucilage, that is the fruit. As coffee matures, enzymes break down pectin chains, which results in a hydrogel. That's kind of how the mucilage is described, a hydrogel, which is essentially a structure that is rich in sugars, pectin, acids, and oil, but contains a lot of moisture within that complex. The higher the altitude, higher altitudes increase the dry matter in the mucilage. So anything that isn't water is considered dry matter. That's the carbs, vitamins, fats, proteins, sugars, acids, all the things that translate into the cup, right? And so this is fairly well known in the plant world, and this is typically why higher grown coffee tends to score a little higher in the cup, right? There are literally just more things in the mucilage supplying the seed. All right, endocarp. The parchment layer. The parchment layer, or the endocarp layer, is kind of a shell that surrounds the actual seed. Endocarp is a strong, crisscrossing cellulosic material, and it really just acts as a barrier to outside damage, and it also holds moisture within the seed because that moisture is necessary for germination. The perisperm, or the silver skin, you can kind of see in that seed down there. The parchment is kind of broken as this coffee is laying on a drying bed. And, that kind of greenish, bluish, silvery hue, that really thin layer that surrounds the seed. It is a nutritive layer. It surrounds the embryo, and that embryo is what develops into, a seed with a fruit around it. And so this layer is surrounding the embryo from the very, very beginning before it's ever a mature fruit. This layer aids in transporting compounds from the fruit layers into the seed layers. And in coffee, we use adherence and kind of the color of that skin to identify coffee ripeness in sorting as it changes throughout its life. All right, now we are getting into the seed itself. It's not really possible to see the embryo in this photo. If you Google, coffee cherry anatomy, you will find little examples of it. But the endosperm, kind of the entire tissue of the seed itself, this is living tissue. It forms cell walls that contain chemical substances, which are essentially food for the embryo. These substances are the precursors to everything we taste. That's really what we are manipulating in processing and drying and roasting and extracting. One of the coolest things to me about this part of coffee is that most plants within their endosperm, they mostly just contain starch, oil, and protein. Coffee is like infinitely abundant in the kind of compounds that are contained within its cell walls. And this to me is like the big differentiator of coffee. It's, in my mind, why it's one of the most complex ingredients on planet Earth. The amount of compounds that we have to work with, that we experience as flavor precursors, is really unique to a coffee seed. You can't just go and roast other seeds from other plants and like get something else, right? Coffee is kind of an anomaly in this way. And I think that's really, really fascinating. The embryo, which is kind of contained in this lower quadrant, when the plant is fertilized, male and female cells form a zygote. That cell consumes energy from the endosperm, and then it grows into a new organism of root, stem, leaves that burst forth from the seed. And so, you know, for me, I think like the key takeaway when looking at a plant's anatomy is that, you know, this organism's driving purpose is to reproduce, to survive in its surroundings, to extend the survival of the species. And so this entire system we've gone through is working together to intake nutrients, deliver them throughout the plant so that it can amass fruit, so that, you know, the endosperm can take in the nutrients from that fruit and give it to the embryo to continue its growth. And then when we think about what a producer is doing, they are basically trying to kind of maximize these systems, right? Maximizing the amount of fruit around that seed, setting that kind of baseline quality that we will work from as coffee continues throughout the chain of production, right? And so I think coffee is kind of an anomaly, a gift from the universe, in the sense that its seed contains things that most all other seeds simply don't. And I think that's what makes coffee, you know, such a special thing. It's one ingredient that contains so much potential. All right. It is 10:30. We're moving pretty good. I put a break in here. I don't know if we need a break, but let's go ahead and take just a little break. I'm going to drink some water, and then we are going to get into the species, varieties, and kind of geography of coffee. This is a great time. If you have any questions from this first section, throw them in here. We can talk about them. But I will just start a quick 3-minute timer that I got from YouTube, and we will kind of just keep going with the class from here on. But yeah, thank you everybody so far. Would love to hear any thoughts at this point. If we're all good, let's continue on. So we've gone from kingdom to genus, right? Kind of labeling parts of coffee as we go. Now we get into species. Species are a group of living organisms
less time than I expected.
that are
I just need to make very quick phone call, very quick, to see if they pick up.
Okay, no problem. They are similar individuals.
Coffee, so
they are capable of exchanging genes or interbreeding. I believe somebody has their mic unmuted. Sandra, if you wouldn't mind muting, sorry about that. And yeah, any species can exchange genes or interbreed. This is a principal taxonomic unit. So think of dogs versus wolves. They are the same species, and they can interbreed with each other. So that is kind of the way to think about it here. So
Estou sim, boa tarde.
we are going to look
Sandra
at.
Azevedo. Eu sou leitora e vou já àquele encontro à formação de leitores.
1 second here.
Eu só queria perguntar onde é que é, porque não sei se é.
All right, so let's get into the phylogenetic tree. Phylogenesis is the evolutionary development of a plant. And we are going to kind of be diving into the phylogenesis of specifically Arabica here as we get into species. But this study done in 1997 shows 37 different species within Rubicae. You can see in bold Arabica down here. Within that kind of same area, Liberica, canephora, right, the Robusta. You can see up at the top, eugenoides, a lot of different species we might be familiar with. In phylogenetic studies, plants or species are basically categorized by their place of origin, right? And so we've probably often heard that Ethiopia is where coffee comes from, but there are so many species within coffee that come from really all across this central to eastern band of Africa and Madagascar. Arabica itself would probably be the one we could say is like from Ethiopia in a way. We're going to kind of get into this. So yeah, this study from 1997, we've got 37 species listed here. So, you know, big questions. How many coffee species are there? What are the characteristics of the economically important species being Arabica and Robusta? And then we're going to get into like, what is Arabica? For me, this was kind of the most interesting thing to investigate with this class. There's a lot about Arabica that I didn't know before beginning working on this class. So this is a study that was done more recently in 2007. In this study, there was an entire subgenus that was adopted into coffee that wasn't originally part of it. And so that's an example of how just like as we study coffee and plants surrounding coffee more and more, we are starting to see different similar characteristics, and this species list is constantly growing. 20 species have been identified in the last 15 years alone. And so genetic studies like the one shown here are resulting in newfound species and adopted subspecies into this genus. There are many institutes such as World Coffee Research, UC Davis, Oxford, you know, in-country coffee institutes that are doing genetic studies, and this list is expanding. Most of the studies from like the last 15 years, you'd see between 100 to 150 species listed. 131 seems to be kind of like the most current consensus in terms of number of coffee species. These gray boxes here, again, are kind of, we have identified where that species originates. So yeah, really interesting that the number of species is constantly growing. And this research is really crucial as we are finding more species that can interbreed, right, to kind of help the genetic pool of coffee. So we are now going to get into, real quick, you know, that chart we just showed, if you kind of look at those different species, I think it's really interesting to look at the different kind of fruit and leaf shapes, just how much variation there are in wild coffee species. Some of these fruits look really crazy compared to what we traditionally think of. So yeah, just kind of a really cool picture there. So let's talk about Arabica and canephora, or Robusta. These numbers, I would note that like these are the most commercially grown species, right? But these figures, you cannot really apply an exact number to it. It really depends on location, cultivation technique, the specific variety within that species you're growing. But kind of on a big picture level, we'll compare these two. So the 60%, 40% world production is getting closer and closer to 55% Arabica, 45 Robusta. That doesn't mean Arabica production is slowing down. It just means Robusta is being grown exponentially a little more than Arabica. And we are nearing 50-50, right? Likely due to climate pressure and things like that. 10 years ago, Arabica comprised about 70% of the world's production. So this number is getting closer to 50-50. And I think it's, you know, good to point out that some scientists are saying that growing Arabica will be unsustainable by 2050 if we kind of just keep going on the trajectory we're going. And so climate pressure is making Robusta easier to grow. In terms of elevation, rain, cultivation, temperature, we can see that Arabica is kind of a higher maintenance plant, right? It requires higher elevation, typically more shade, more space, lower temperatures, greater pest and fertilization management. And then let's look at this chlorogenic acid, caffeine content. These two components, they're natural pest repellents. And again, that's what makes these species all kind of group together into that eucafe category, the fact that they produce caffeine. Chlorogenic acids are a predominant class of phenolic acids, right? When we think of like phenolic flavors in the cup, we think like bitterness, right? Medicinal. Those are commonly called tannic acids. So chlorogenic and caffeine content both contribute to cup bitterness. Growing condition, roast level can affect their concentration in the roasted seed, but Robusta contains more of these properties, right? And so, that's partly why Robusta has a more bitter taste than Arabica. Sucrose and sugar content. Let's see, Arabica is at 6 to 9%, while Robusta is at 3 to 7%. Again, this is very variable, but Arabica typically has a higher sugar content, hence its more broadly appreciated flavor profile, right? And so Arabica requires more maintenance, but produces typically higher cup quality, fetches higher prices in the market. It's usually what we're drinking in specialty coffee. And Arabica has a really, really interesting history behind it. If it's been a while since you've had a cup of Robusta, I would highly recommend seeking some out, comparing it just for the flavor profile difference. Cool. So what is Arabica? We're going to dive into Arabica now. We're going to kind of examine what makes it unique and the challenges that it's facing at this current time. So it'll go to the next page. Arabica. Something I didn't know for a long, long time working in coffee is that Arabica is a hybrid. It is a hybridized species of canephora, Robusta, and Eugenioides. So Arabica is not just like, a singular distinct species. It is a hybridized, it was a single hybridization event that happened to produce Arabica. Hybridization is the process in which two complementary single-stranded DNA or RNA molecules bond together and form a double-stranded molecule. And so hybridization in the plant world typically happens under pressure, like environmental pressures cause these two distinct species to hybridize and produce a new species. And so we can note that like canephora and Eugenioides, they are likely most native to areas that are west of now Ethiopia. They had some crossover in what we call Uganda, and that is likely where the hybridization occurred. And this kind of estimation of where these plants are indigenous to is done through genetic studies. But we can see Arabica is native to mostly Ethiopia. And so this hybridization event occurred in this kind of area that's highlighted in Uganda, but then the Arabica species kind of distanced itself into Ethiopia. And this is actually something that is really common in these spontaneous hybridization events, is that new hybrid becomes kind of ecologically divergent because of the pressure that it was produced under. What made it move? It's hard to say. But that is kind of as far back as genetic studies have traced where Arabica is from. But point here, I think it's really interesting to think about. If you've ever had Eugenioides, it's like not bitter at all. It has very low chlorogenic acid content, very low caffeine content, really high sugar content. And then there's canephora, right? And so it's kind of like cool to think about how these two different cups would create a new species in terms of flavor profile. It makes a lot of sense. All right, let's go into a little chart here. So we're going to kind of just like outline really basically kind of how this hybridization event occurred and what that means for Arabica. So this event, as far as we can estimate, happened between 1.08 million and 543,000 years ago. That sounds like a long time, but in the grand scheme, that's not very long for a species. Arabica is the youngest species within the Coffea genus. It is the newest species. With that, Arabica hasn't had a lot of time to differentiate as much as other species, which is really interesting. So yeah, it is the youngest taxa within the phylogenetic tree. All species outside of Arabica are diploids, meaning they have 22 chromosomes. Coffee plants in particular have 22 chromosomes that are diploids. When these two plants hybridized, Arabica inherited both sets of chromosomes, making Arabica an allopolyploid species. It is the only allopolyploid within Coffea. So Arabica took both sets from the parents, meaning it has 4 copies of the same chromosome, resulting in 44 chromosomes. And I think kind of, what that means is that Arabica has a lot of traits hidden behind one chromosome that it can present. Allopolyploids are becoming more and more common in the plant world. Things like wheat. A lot of the commercially grown wheat nowadays is an allopolyploid. And there are some other commercially grown plants. Grass, this is really common in. The thing with diploids is they have great kind of like long-term survivability, while allopolyploids have great short-term survivability. And again, they're usually created under kind of intense environmental pressure. And so if you kind of like look into this, there's a lot of studies linked in the supporting document. There's some kind of contention as far as like which one has more genetic variation, which one has more survivability. But basically, when Arabica was produced and it inherited both these DNA strands, it also became the only self-compatible species, meaning it can continue to produce itself. And that's kind of why it became divergent. Diploids are not self-compatible. This kind of encourages diversification with other plants, right? Other pollen, but Arabica can continue to reproduce by itself. So there's pros and cons to both of these compatibilities. There's a lot of stuff we could talk about here. A lot of it I don't completely understand yet. But it, again, I think highlights just how unique coffee is amongst everything else. But yeah, wheat, cotton, cabbage are all polyploids. And basically, through the genetic research, we were able to identify canephora and eugenoides as the progenitor species. This was likely a single event. The problem with Arabica kind of happening like this and then becoming divergent from other species, namely its parent species, is that it has created a really big genetic bottleneck for coffee. These 44 chromosomes contain all the traits that every variety of Arabica pretty much will ever have, right? And so these are the traits we have. We will see subtly different expressions of it. But when it became divergent and kind of grew by itself in Ethiopia, not surrounded by many other species, it didn't change very much. So then when coffee finally starts to expand in the 1690s, it hadn't adapted to many different places, meaning like these traits have not evolved very much from the time it was speciated. So yeah, a single speciation event creates low genetic diversity. And then the wild Arabica we do see in Ethiopia is in danger of extinction because it's been so comfortable for so long. Allopolyploids, again, they become ecologically divergent in order to survive and get away from the pressures that it was under. And this event hasn't happened again. In a lab, in nature, we have not been able to have canephora and eugenoides speciate Arabica. And so that is why this is such a bottleneck, right? There's kind of this one event, some people think likely one plant that happened, and every variety, every Arabica grown today carries the same traits as that one plant. And this makes it very difficult to adapt to climate change, right? And so that is the problem Arabica is facing. That is why it is estimated that coffee will be unsustainable by 2050 because of this event that happened not that long ago, and then hasn't experienced very much variation since then. And so this is kind of the Arabica problem, essentially. But a lot of these recent genetic studies are basically in an effort to figure out what can we do, what can we cross Arabica with, what are different hybrids we can create that will help Arabica evolve and adapt to these challenges we are facing. So again, there's this huge period of time where coffee is not really domesticated. Wheat was domesticated like 10,000 years ago, it was estimated, right? Coffee wasn't really domesticated very much, you know, leading up to the 1600s outside of where it was natively grown. And so there's a very limited gene pool here. That is kind of the problem I think that coffee is facing on this ecological level. So again, the expansion of Arabica begins around 1690, and those problems are that it is very young, it has very specific growing conditions, it has a limited gene pool, all making coffee more and more challenging to grow. So how is this challenge being combated? I've kind of talked about this. Scientists are discovering wild varieties, really old varieties, and really old Arabica species. They're creating hybrids. There's been lots of sequencing of the Arabica genome that is kind of in the works and has happened. UC Davis genomed geisha in 2022. And people are trying to reproduce this speciation event. And so all of this is an effort to expand the gene pool of coffee. And I think for me, I think like, okay, well, what can I actually do about this? And I think that's a big inspiration of this series of classes, right? I think awareness can help initiate change. I think for consumers of coffee, the more they know about the stakes of what the environment is kind of doing to Arabica, the more awareness there is of what's going on. I think a lot of other industries that grow in different places have gotten a lot of attention and a lot of study, right? But like coffee hasn't, likely because of where it is predominantly grown. And so I think to initiate change, it's important in our day-to-day lives to just be informed and inform others. That's kind of my personal takeaway from this information. All right. Let's see, Jonah, is there a common name for Eugenoides? Not that I have heard. Yeah, not that I have heard. I've always just heard it as that. In fact, I thought it was a variety and not an entire different species the first time I encountered it. So again, we've kind of gone through the taxonomic ranks, right? We've gone all the way from kingdom to species. Now we're getting into varieties. Varieties are basically groups of plants at the lowest taxonomic rank, defined by their reproducible genetic characteristics. There are 5 types of varieties that we're going to look at, and then there are 4 big categories of different coffee varieties. And we're basically looking at the recent work of World Coffee Research and their coffee family tree to kind of define those 4 families. So yeah, when we think of varieties, I think of like apples, right? We got Gala, Granny Smith, Red Delicious, all these different varieties of apples. That's how it is here. So variety is kind of a blanket term. All these other definitions would kind of fall as like, it's a variety, right? But there are different specific kinds of varieties. Cultivars. Cultivars are cultivated varieties. So these are varieties that have been produced through like just humans continuing to grow this variety for its desired traits. A lot of coffee we consume are probably cultivars, right? They are cultivated again and again and again, generation after generation. Hybrids are crosses between either 2 varieties, multiple varieties, or a variety and a species, within the same genus, right? And so an Arabica variety and a Robusta variety is a hybrid, just like 2 Arabica varieties. An heirloom variety is a cultivar that has been maintained for a long, long time. Some places will say 50 plus years, some will say 100 plus years. A lot of times it depends on the agricultural industry that you're talking with, that has different rules for heirloom. But yeah, they've been maintained for generations, kind of like in one area. And then a landrace is pretty similar. A lot of these like wild types would be considered land races. They are domesticated, localized varieties that have evolved either through natural or agricultural techniques. And so these are the different kind of varieties. There is a point we could talk about here, and that is the difference between variety and varietal. If we ask, is variety or varietal correct? Typically, variety is the most correct way when we're talking about coffee. Varietal is an adjective used to describe something. So it's the difference between like globe and global, friend or friendly, thoughtful, spiritual. I think the confusion here comes from varietal wine. A varietal wine is essentially a bottle of wine that is comprised of 75+% of one variety of grape. But when we're talking about a specific variety, variety is usually the most correct term to use. There's no such thing essentially as a geisha varietal or a typica varietal. It is a variety. And the reason I bring this up is, it might not be the most important thing in the world to use the correct term, but I think like using the correct scientific language is valuable. It's good to be purposeful with our language because our words do hold power, and accuracy can promote both understanding and legitimacy of our industry. And so variety is the correct term to use when we're talking about different coffee varieties. So let's look at variety groups. Again, this family tree here was recently developed by World Coffee Research. And that's what I'm using to kind of describe this. I think it's really, really well done. And they kind of define a bunch of major groups of varieties. And we're going to go over the big four that would fall into Arabica. So Ethiopia landrace, Bourbon and Typica group, F1 hybrids, and introgressed varieties such as Cadimore and Sarchimore groups. We won't talk much about the history of these groups. We're more just looking at like what's going on right now. This is kind of just a small sample of all the varieties that are out there because there are thousands and thousands and thousands of them. For example, Ethiopia landrace, some of our oldest varieties. It's estimated there's anywhere between 10 to 15,000 landrace and heirloom varieties in Ethiopia alone. So much just subtle variation from area to area. Their origin, likely the forest in which Arabica speciated, right? And so these old varieties are direct evolutions from that original Arabica plant. They have really high cup quality, lower yields. Examples, Rumey Sudan, Geisha, Java, varieties like that. It's those green varieties up in the top left. Next big group, likely the most commercial group, Bourbon and Typica group. So those trees that went to Yemen and then like Amsterdam and to all these different places, we'll look at that a little more in depth. These trees were eventually dispersed throughout Central and South America, developing into this really large commercial group of cultivars. In Brazil right now, 97.5% of cultivars grown there are within this Bourbon and Typica group. And so the Bourbon here is the orange. Typica, you can see kind of that top left brown. You can see they are directly linked to Arabica. So they are direct, varieties descended from Arabica as they moved. And then as they've moved, they have turned into new cultivars, right? And so you can see within that Typica group, some really common ones we've heard of are Harar, Pache, and then those have been crossed with things to create Margot Hipe, Mundo Nuevo. In fact, there's a Typica Bourbon cross that created the Mundo Nuevo. Within this Bourbon group, Pacas, Kent, really common varieties. So many varieties in this leftmost cluster, this entire left side from Arabica, have been hybridized with Bourbon or Typica to create other really prevalent varieties. Introgressed hybrids are basically varieties that have been hybridized with a separate species, right? And so these introgressed Sarchimore catamore groups are Arabica varieties that were introgressed with Robusta. And these all come from Timor, a Southeast Asian island. The goal when these were created was to inherit disease resistance and the yield potential of Robusta while still retaining some cup quality, right? So Catamore is basically a Timor hybrid, the large gray circle. A Timor hybrid was crossed with Caturra to produce some of the common hybrids we see here that are grown throughout Central and South America, like Icafe 90, Lempira, Costa Rica 95, Paranema, or excuse me, that's in the Sarchimore group. The Catamore are these light greens. So yeah, an Arabica and Robusta created a Timor hybrid, and then that Timor hybrid was crossed with something else to create these. In the Sarchimore group, a Timor hybrid was crossed with Viasarchi of the Bourbon group to produce some of these, like the Paranema and Abada hybrids. These groups are becoming more predominant for, again, those character traits. And then F1 hybrids. F1 hybrids are pretty common in agriculture. They are basically selectively bred first-gen hybrids of two genetically uniform varieties. So in this case, old Ethiopian landrace variety crossed with, another variety who has desirable traits. And then the F1 denotes that first generation variety that comes from that hybrid. F1 hybrids benefit from what's called hybrid vigor, meaning they exhibit kind of the best traits of both parents and they have really high production. These hybrids are multiplied and sold through hand pollination or through cloning techniques. If you collect seeds and replant from these F1 hybrids, that is an F2 hybrid. These second generation hybrids will segregate, meaning they have typically pretty varying performance. They are not recommended to grow. Like the World Coffee Research will say, we do not recommend these. They typically don't have great production, and this is true in any kind of plant we're talking about. This means that F1 hybrids are kind of one-time use. They're pretty expensive. They are something that are being used as a solution to a lot of problems Arabica faces, but it's not as sustainable as being able to just, reproduce from plants you already have, right? Examples of these are Mundo Maya, Centro Americano, Millenio, but we see lots of producing country programs giving these plants to producers to try, right? There's lots of trials with them. It's a pretty recent thing in coffee. The World Coffee Research released their first F1s in 2010 for study. So yeah, kind of a new thing, a possible solution, but a labor-intensive and expensive one, I would say. Again, you can go to varieties.World Coffee Research to kind of look at this map. It's really interesting. I love tracing varieties back. You kind of get a picture of like the history of a certain variety that you're interested in or really like. All right, y'all, how we doing here? It's 11:11. Not too bad. We've got just one more really small section here. Close. We'll have time for questions if you want. Great. So some geography. We'll go through coffee's habitat. We'll look at how coffee expanded, where it's produced, where it's imported. So now we're getting back to our TWUP, tropical woody understory perennial. So species of coffee. They are tropical, meaning they grow in areas with high temperatures throughout the year, typically no winter season. generally high humidity in these areas, and then high precipitation, typically within a distinct rainy season. So that's kind of our tropical definition. This rings true for most places coffee is grown, right? Woody is a plant classification. Again, trees and shrubs, regardless of size or proportion, they are woody because their stem has secondary growth, right? Like bark around it. The stems throughout their life grow in diameter and they make tree rings. So coffee has tree rings. It is a woody plant. Understory. Understory defines where exactly it grows, right? Like its height. The understory layer is growth, the area of growth beneath the forest canopy, but above the forest floor, right? It's kind of that middle zone. This middle zone, right above the shrub layer, has typically higher humidity than that canopy layer. There's less temperature change in the soil because of shade in this area. And just lower temperatures overall than being exposed to the sun, right? Most all coffee species are shade tolerant, but many Arabica varieties like really thrive in lower light. So yeah, coffee is an understory plant. And then coffee is perennial. Perennials are plants that live longer than 2 years. Coffee can live up to, like 100 years, but they are definitely most productive kind of from that 7 to 20 year range, depending on the variety you're looking at. So now let's kind of zoom out one more time and look at coffee's movement and then kind of where it is today. So yellow circle over Ethiopia. Again, that's kind of the proposed origin of Coffea arabica. The best, most specific estimation would be the southwestern Ethiopian highlands, eastern Sudan, like the Boma Plateau area, and then northern Kenya near Mount Marsabit. That's like where scientists think like that is kind of that speciation area where then coffee moved to. This is Coffea arabica's primary center of diversity. That's how that is found, where the most amount of the most diverse plants today. So yeah, that's approximately where that speciation occurred. So point number one, pink. Coffea arabicas began being cultivated when coffee was introduced from Ethiopia to Yemen, developing typica from allegedly one parent plant, and that was in 575 AD or earlier. In 1690, that's where we start to see movement too, right? It goes south. Let's see, which one is too late to be south. Plants from Mocha travel to the Bourbon Islands or La Reunion, resulting in the Bourbon variety. So it's that south movement, and then that eastern movement is typica that went to India and then Java. And then number three, moving back up north from that India Java area to point number three is when typica went to Amsterdam and was cultivated in the botanical gardens around 1706 to 1710. And then point number four, around 1720, Coffea arabica is brought to Suriname, and then moved up and down, right, into northern Brazil, up to Martinique, and then eventually expanding more into the rest of Central and South America. So this map highlights kind of the massive Bourbon and Typica groups, and how essentially subsequent generations adapted to these new areas, right, resulting in more varieties, more crosses, more cultivars, eventually becoming that largest group grown throughout the world. We're not necessarily going to discuss the history of coffee's initial movement. I will say it's largely undocumented, concerning its domestication with Arabica and its dispersion by humids. But that is a topic I would love to get into more. And I think there are people out there who also really covering it in expert ways that consider all the people that coffee has involved since this time, right? That's kind of the basics of coffee's movement. So now where coffee is produced, this is a map Cafe Imports produced a while ago. And we can see the coffee belt, as we call it, overlaps the tropics almost entirely, right? The Tropic of Cancer to Capricorn is that coffee belt. Around 70 countries produce coffee, around 50 export. But obviously, as the climate is changing, coffee regions are changing. This is, I think, definitely true for specialty. Examples of this is like the amount production has increased in China or California. Again, scientists predict that by 2050, coffee farmland within this coffee belt could decrease by 50%. That is kind of how drastic things are changing for coffee and where it is grown. And that is why those numbers of like where Robusta is being grown are changing really dramatically as well. But yeah, that is predominantly where coffee is produced. And then we look at where coffee is imported, right? The thing that, I kind of look at this map, the thing that strikes me is the contrast between, quote unquote, developing and developed countries economically. And again, this kind of talks to the history of coffee, how it was used to establish colonization. There are so many stories we can read of people who are indigenous to areas using coffee, though, to advance their own autonomy as it becomes a big part of commerce. The history of coffee is a really fascinating subject. It's daunting, but it's really important to tackle. If you've heard of the 1619 Project, I'd highly recommend checking that out. To develop a narrative of the history of coffee that actually, accurately reflects the reality of the industry's expansion over the years. That is typically where coffee is imported. So, closing takeaways. I would love to hear from anybody who has any thoughts. I would love to know, did you learn anything new? Did you know all of this? Has your definition of coffee changed? There's a lot of science I realized out there about coffee, so many studies that have been done that I haven't heard of that are really fascinating. Why isn't this kind of science more centered in our industry? And then the questions that came from developing this class for me is, how much value and how much more do I value the plant, the science, the people? For me, the plant itself, it has a really rich but undocumented history. It's a plant that was developed with really specific needs under specific conditions with a small gene pool. Coffee's a living organism that has to have a balance to thrive within the natural world, right? But much of coffee is really threatened. But it is, I don't know, it was encouraging to find out that there is a pretty large community of researchers devoting to identifying these problems and finding solutions through lots of different means for coffee. And so I think it's important to understand what all this means as participators in the industry. And yeah, I think, I don't know, there's something to be said for the complexity of coffee, the fact that was almost produced by chance so long ago. And I personally, through doing this research, understand coffee more as being kind of a gift, right? An anomaly and a gift for us. And so understanding coffee as a plant for me makes me more grateful for access to it, right? The fact that it even exists. And I don't know, it motivates me to do what I can for the plant and for everybody who interacts with it along the chain, right? So I really appreciate y'all's attention. Thank you for joining us. You can email me, education@cafeimports.com. I want to throw up all the different references I used for creating this class. Again, the supporting document has all these references with direct links to these pages or these studies that you can download.